Hello to another post-processing video. In the last video I showed you how I took the sunrise photos at Anse Cocos on La Digue. I explained how in situations with the sun in the frame I usually focus to the background and take bracketed exposures to get in the whole dynamic range, and then focus to the foreground and use my hand to shield out the sun to avoid lens flares in that part. Today I want to show you how to blend such photos. A few weeks ago I already did a tutorial on exposure blending, but usually every blend is a bit different and there are many techniques I use to blend exposures. For this photo here, the clouds were moving between the different bracketed exposures, so I had to be careful during the blending to avoid ghosting effects. I couldn't just use luminosity masks to blend together the exposures, but I also didn't want to take the dark exposure for the complete sky area, because especially on the right side it would quickly get noisy once I applied some more processing to the photo. Before we now dive in and I show you what I did here, only one last disclaimer. This tutorial will involve many of the techniques I showed in my previous tutorials. I'll link a few in the description below, so in case you have problems following along, please check out the other tutorials first. Okay, so let's start. For the blend I will first blend those exposures for the background and the sky, so the layers called sun dark and sun bright, and then I'll blend in this middle back area where I have the hand, so this basically removes any lens flares and gives me a clean middle and foreground. And then I have another frame which is called foreground, which I'll use to blend in some detail in the very close foreground. So what I'll do, I'll put a mask on this bright exposure and I do a hard edge blend, or let's not call it hard edge because actually I'm using a soft edge brush here, but it's still a hard blend because I'm not using any masks, so I just use a black brush at 100% and I draw around the area which I want to use from the dark frame. So basically I reveal the darker exposure in this area here. And yeah, this looks horrible at first. So what I now have to do is I need to get the exposures right for both. So what I'll do, I'll create a curves layer and holding down Alt, I clip it to this bright exposure. And when I now darken this, so by pulling down in the curve, it will only affect the bright exposure. So I'll darken the bright exposure a bit, and then I'll put a curves layer above this darker frame. And here I don't need to clip it because there's nothing else beneath. And this one I'll brighten. And you see how by darkening the bright exposure and brightening the dark exposure, I get both closer together. So I'm just looking, or specifically looking at this transition here. And I'm not worrying about darkening those rocks now. This will be fixed later. First I want to get this transition in the sky right. And now I'll take a brush with like 30%, and here in this area where I have the transition, there are no moving clouds. So I can paint a bit and refine the blend without worrying about ghosting effects. So this is what I do now. Let's look at the mask. So what I'm doing, so I'm basically, let's first fill this up here. So I'm basically smoothing out this transition a bit, and by darkening and brightening I get a very clean transition here. So let's undo this, maybe use 10% and try to get this very convincing transition. And what you can do for such transitions where you need to align the exposures, so to say, you can put a curves layer above it, which you just use as a helper layer, and you put a very strong contrast here and darken it. And this way you can see very good if the transition is still not good enough. So I just paint a bit to get this transition right. Okay, I think that's good enough for a start, and what I can do later, I can use a little bit of dodge and burn to further work on flaws in this transition. But for this demonstration, I think it's sufficient. So what I now need to do, as I said, this darkening also darkened the rocks, which I don't want. So for this here, I can now use Lumensia to create a luminosity mask. So this is what you know from my other tutorials. So I'll first try D4 and see, oh yeah, that's very good selection for the rocks. And I also refine this a bit by pulling those levels closer together. So I get a very good selection for the rocks here. I grab Lumensia and select this. Takes a while. I hide the selection and now I paint with black and 100%. Well, let's start with 70 into this area with the rocks. And by this I reveal the detail again. And yeah, what I also do, as in my last tutorial, I deselect the mask, and for this foreground, for example, I just get back the detail without using any mask. So as I said in previous tutorials, it's always a combination of drawing through luminosity masks and of using normal masking. So let's look closer. So without the mask, this would be darkened far too much. With the mask now, this looks fine. And the same is true here for this brightening. So I don't necessarily want to brighten this sun area too much, and again I can grab Lumensia and I try the Lights 5, which selects just the very bright tones. I select it, and now let's hide the mask first, and with a black brush and like 20% I bring back the detail in the very bright tones a bit. Looking at the mask, so I don't lose too much details here. So this is the dark exposure, and now this is the blend, and yeah, doing the blend like this, I avoid any ghosting in those brighter areas. And what I can also do, I see it, so here the water is a little bright, and I will just use a black brush with like 30% and try to bring back a little bit of details here. And I don't even use a luminosity mask here, because for such water areas where you have some waves and ripples, it usually doesn't look too good. So I'm just drawing a little bit of detail in here. Yeah, and now I'm basically done. This is the blend for the dark and bright frame, and gives me a very good detail throughout the frame. So I merge this down, hitting Ctrl E, and now I can continue. The first thing I want to do now is clean up this transition here between the sky and the very bright area around the sun a bit, because it's a little harsh here and doesn't look too good. And what I can do, I just use a new layer, grab Lumensia, select very bright areas. Oops, this were the dark, so let's select the bright areas. Grab a selection, ignore the last selection, and now I just use a brush. Let's hide this. Sample an area close to the sun here, and with like 5% I draw around those edges a bit. So I grab a soft brush here, and this evens out this transition to the sun. And let's grab here a bit. And on this side, so let's see the before and after. So this smoothes out this transition, but what I'll do, let's deselect, get the eraser, and let's make this a little smoother, like 100%. I avoid any drawing where the sun is, so I want to leave this area completely white. So always be careful, don't apply this technique to the whole area. If you do this, you don't have any white area in your image, and this is not convincing. The area where the sun is should be white. But still this smoothes out the transition a bit, and I can reduce the opacity. And now flatten this down, Control E. And I can now continue with the last part of the blend. So let's first auto align those 3 layers. And I didn't do the auto align for the bracketed exposures because those are already aligned, so I didn't change any settings. But now here for those I did refocusing, and this usually changes the frame a little bit, and you will need auto align first. So let's do this. Now I quickly check the alignment. This looks good. Go to another area. Looks good. Okay. So first let's blend this layer with the middle black, sorry. Put a black mask on it. And so I want to use this layer for the complete foreground. So basically just beneath where the hand is, and I'll just use a white brush at 100%, and I draw along this edge, draw around here and here. Go to the mask, and this is basically what I show in my introduction to focus stacking. So I have another video where I show this technique. So it's the same, and basically by using this mask I now have all those areas from this frame. And let me show you why I did this, or why I needed this. So I don't have many lens flares because the Case filters I was using hold up very well against any lens flares, and also the sun wasn't too bright. But you see here this little area, this is a little bit of a lens flare which I could just clone out, but here, as I have this frame, I just use this. And also around here I have a little bit of a lens flare, and also this frame here has a little bit more detail, so I'll blend it in. And yeah, just use a white brush with like 40% and mask in some areas. And I'm not using any masks yet, so for this area here in the middle I don't have to, there are no edges where I need to be careful. And here I'll do like 30%, and also here I'll bring back the exposure. What I also do, again, I need a curves layer, clip it to this foreground layer, darken it a bit to have it basically at the same exposure. And as I showed in other tutorials, I go to the blend if and basically protect the very dark tones here, so the darkening will not affect the very dark areas. Press OK. Yeah, and I'm basically done. I could now use Lumensia again, get a dark selection, refine the selection, same steps as before. So now select this, hide the selection, and bring in a little bit more detail here from this middle back layer, because it has a little more details. Yeah, look at the mask. Just fill in those areas a bit more. And yeah, that's basically it. That's the first step, which removes most of the lens flares. We should have a look at this here. So this is also gone in this selection, or in this exposure. What I'll do, I'll grab this magic wand and select areas so the sky which I don't want to blend in. So I just select this, which gives me a good selection. I invert the selection, and now basically have selected this area, and with a white brush and like 100%, I can just bring in this area from this middle back exposure and remove the lens flares. Now as you see, this is much too bright, so I put in another curves layer. I darken this very much. Let's first invert it, make it black now. And I'll just paint with white to this area again to get the exposure right. Let's zoom out, before and after, so this lens flare gone, lens flares here gone. And yeah, that's basically this blend. Let's flatten down again. And now I have a foreground layer, and that's the same procedure. Black mask, get in close, 100% white brush, and look where it's sharper, so basically this area here. And yeah, I'm doing this very quickly now because the tutorial is already getting a bit longer, so this is just very rough to show you the principle again for the focus stacking. Also put in a curves layer, clip it, just the exposure. Then protect the very dark tones. Flatten down, and I'm done with the blend. And from here it's my normal post-processing, which you'll find in my more in-depth tutorials on my homepage. So I hope you found this helpful, and yeah, if so, please leave a thumbs up. And if you have questions, just leave a comment.